Welcome to Ye Olde Guide. Today we're taking a break from our usual city guides and having a special episode diving deep into a topic that has shaped English towns and cities for centuries. Today we're talking about city walls. We spoke about city walls before in our episodes on Chester, Great Yarmouth, Colchester and Coventry, but we wanted to talk a bit more about these fascinating structures. Walls and defensive structures were once critical to protecting towns from criminality, conflict and attack, as well as for controlling trade and imposing tariffs on merchants. Although today they're found in varying states of completeness, they have left a legacy in many settlements, beyond what you might see as visible defensive structures today. From shaping the urban layout to creating social divisions and even constraining the growth of cities, city walls have had a profound influence on the places we visit. Go to many towns in the UK and the legacy of defensive structures will be there in the pattern and the names of the streets. Delighted to introduce Daniel Gooch, historian and my co-host. Daniel, you've done a lot of research into walled towns for this episode. What got you inspired to talk about city walls and walled cities?
I suppose it's a couple of things. It's that city walls, as we'll see later, have been a pretty rare feature of English towns and cities compared certainly with our continental neighbours. Also, I think they form a real, tangible, a huge, colossal urban link with our past. So they're one of the most exciting visual links you'll see to any town and city's history. So yeah, they're fascinating things to look at. And yes, lots of research. Really enjoyed researching this episode. Yeah,
definitely. I remember as a kid, we grew up in Ipswich, but you'd go to nearby Colchester for a day out and that had very cool city walls, and I remember as a kid really liking them, but Great Yarmouth as well.
Although Ipswich did have its own, unfortunately the last parts were knocked down earlier in the 20th century. Tower Ramparts bus station, if you ever caught a bus in Ipswich, then you'll know exactly where that is. That used to have, before a car park was built there in the 20th century, a small kind of hump running along the middle, and there were some houses built on there, some Victorian houses. That was the last remaining normally visible part of the town's defences, which to be honest were more just banks and of earth and ditches. Although there is one tiny bit of the walls supposedly still remaining. If you go to the Halberd Inn, used to be an Irish pub, I think McGinty's, wasn't it, in our day?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. If you go down to the cellar there, I've heard, it's unverified, but I've heard they do have some traces of the North Gate in their cellar. So next time we're there, we'll have to pluck up the courage to ask them if we can see it.
Do you know, that's a very nice pub. I went there on Ipswich Music Day and there was some band in there. It was really nice. Excellent pub. We will pluck up the courage. Halberd Inn, Northgate Street. And of course, one thing we do know about Ipswich is it has a Northgate Street, it has a Westgate Street, it has gates. So, and that's something we're going to talk about. All right, then let's go for it. Tell us about city walls.
There used to be quite a lot of city walls in England. Between 1050 and 1550, evidence suggests there were at least, I should emphasise at least, 144 known towns or cities in England which had fortifications of some kind. And this represents about probably 20% of what we could consider proper urban settlements. Just over half of these had masonry walls. The other were simple earthworks like the ones in Ipswich that we mentioned. But this did represent towns of all sizes, from large to small, and they did serve multiple purposes. They didn't just serve the purpose of defending the towns and cities, which was particularly common, say, on the Welsh or Scottish borders or on the coast, but some of them were also commercial. They formed a barrier where tariffs would be collected from tradesmen entering the city, or the commercial activity of the town or trade of the town could be controlled. Now, although 20% might sound like a lot, England was actually quite conspicuous by its lack of city fortifications compared with the rest of Europe. For instance, in Germany, over the same period, about 40%, double the percentage of German towns were fortified. There's a very interesting little account of visiting English cities by the German novelist Karl Moritz in the 1780s. What he noted was that the lack of walls gave a sense of freedom to the English urban environment. I'll read what he said because it's very interesting. He said, "It strikes a foreigner as something particular and unusual when, on passing through these fine English towns, he observed no walls, no gates, no sentries nor garrisons. No stern examiner comes here to search and inspect us or our baggage. No imperious guard here demands a sight of our passports. Perfectly free and unmolested, we here walk through villages and towns as unconcerned as we should through a house of our own." even London, although it did have city walls around its old core, was exceptional among major European capitals in the Middle Ages for not having walls around its expanding suburbs as the city's footprint crept outward. Now, the obvious reason for this difference between England and the continent is that relative to the continent, where borders changed and conflict over land could be rife, England as an island and as a stable kingdom tended to be pretty stable, with relatively minimal threat of attack to towns and cities, especially after the Norman conquest. But this did mean also the physical decline of English city walls started quite early as some of their purpose went away. This happened particularly in the 16th century, before there was one last resurgence of city defences during the Civil War. But despite this anomaly, the overall trajectory was clear. Town walls ceased to have a practical defensive function after the restoration of the monarchy in most cases. And by the Georgian era, aside from a few northern fortifications against the ongoing Jacobite threat, really the only remaining use for walls was as a source of building materials, or perhaps for a form of proto-tourism as part of the branding of historic towns, or for leisure usage. And it was really around this time that English antiquarians and civic authorities started to make decisions for the first time about the historic features of their towns that were important and worth preserving. This had links to more abstract forms of preservation, such as the birth of written records of urban landscapes, but also quite directly to the discovery and excavations of Pompeii in the 18th and early 19th centuries, which just on its own started to inspire new interest in tangible forms of urban history. It wasn't necessarily an easy choice just to choose to preserve your city walls. That there was perhaps no obvious reason at that time why civic authorities should spend precious funds restoring these often to them useless and crumbling structures. They're expensive to maintain, often dangerous, as well as constraining the growth of cities as industrialisation led to rising populations in towns. So in many cases, what seemed like the sensible decision actually took place, and many of the walls were torn down. And when this happened, it didn't seem to result in much protest. It usually required quite a lot of determination and decisive action to preserve walls, except in the rare cases where there was some ongoing use for them. And what we're going to look at now is some of our favourite towns and cities where these walls have survived, whether by decisive purpose or by fortunate accident. One thing before we go on, I just want to give some credit here to Professor Rowie Sweet of the Historic Towns Trust. She did an excellent talk I attended a while ago for the Historic Towns Trust on the birth of the English historical town, and that's inspired quite a lot of what I've thought about today. So basically what you're saying is, although we go to towns and we see these city walls and we think they're fantastic, historic and fun, to people 200 years ago, they'd have just been a pain, just getting in the way. Not just getting in the way, dangerous, crumbling.
So
absolutely.
No wonder they got rid of them. And I suppose, or except for, and you're going to talk about a couple of places where they very much haven't got rid of them, but you're saying that was an active choice to brand the town as a tourist town. In some cases, yes. In some cases, there was still actually a practical purpose to some of the walls when they'd been repurposed early as leisure facilities, or in some cases been set up particularly to control trade going into the city. Sometimes that particular function carried on a bit later. So the other thing, like you mentioned European cities, and it is notable as well as there being more of these structures, they seem to take up more space as well. So if you think of cities like Vienna, which got rid of its walls, it left a big gap in the city, which it's turned into a lot of open space around its centre, because they seem to be these larger fortifications, whereas the English walls tend to be exactly that, walls with towers.
Yeah, and I think that part of that is because the need to defend the cities really went away quite early on. Apart from that resurgence we mentioned in the Civil War, the trajectory towards English towns and cities as being pretty relatively safe places had been going on for quite a long time. So there was not so much need to invest precious funds into expanding and building new town walls as time went on.
Now, I know your favourite town in Britain, in England. I know your favourite town.
Is this a spoiler alert for when we come to do an episode on this place?
I know your favourite town. It is a spoiler alert. We will be doing an episode on this. I know your favourite town in the country, favourite city in the country is York.
Absolutely, York.
Not a bad choice. So let's start with York.
We'll talk about York. I won't go off gushing too much about the city today. I'll try and keep it targeted because you can gush as much as you want about York's walls, really. They are amazing. They're 2.75 miles long. They have a full walkway on the top. They encircle the historic centre with a fantastic view of all the wonderful sights of the city. The walls structurally encompass numerous eras. They incorporate Roman, Norman and medieval stretches, though a lot of the stone you can see does date from more recent renovations in the last 200 years. Personally, I love that the walls are high up, distinctive, not shut away, not hidden behind buildings. They are a distinct and key feature of the city. But the walls weren't always so appreciated in the city. There was no mention at all of the walls in 18th century guides to the city. There was no depiction of the walls artistically in their own right until the 1800s, and when they started to be depicted, they were shown to be in a very poor state at that point. This is because lots of the building materials had been sold off, and unlike in other cities, there was no specific tax, local tax or other means of funding the upkeep of the walls. And even as late as the 1840s, a giant hole was punched into the walls to bring the railway into the city to the original York station, which is a brief aside you can still see today. The building still stands inside the city walls, despite being later replaced by the current station. And even in the 1870s, road arches were knocked through, one in 1874 and 1876, which you could barely imagine happening today. But what changed in York was a general interest in the preservation of heritage. Rory Sweet gave an interesting view on this. She said this was partly a political response to the modernising order of the French Revolution, which was contrasted with the perception in England of unplanned and organic growth of historic townscapes here. And also really locally in York, this desire to separate the cityscape there from that of more obviously industrialised cities. And practically, this led to the first fundraising campaigns to preserve the walls from the 1820s. And this was the first time in England there had ever been such a fundraising campaign to maintain a non-religious building. So clearly they were of extreme local importance at that point. Highlights of the walls today, as well as the extensive walkway along the top, include the gates and the towers that still stand, and those are still used for practical purposes today. Two of them were used until very recently for nice little museums on Richard III and Henry VII. Unfortunately, they both closed after coronavirus, but one has recently reopened as a museum simply about the walls themselves. And another tower, which was previously a house, was used until a coffee shop not long ago. To pick a couple of the best gates, Micklegate bar just being a name for a gateway, was built in the 12th century, 4 floors tall and partly of reused Roman stone. It was used to display body parts of executed traitors, similar to the gates of other walls around the country. Unfortunately, it had its barbican, which was the protruding fortified area at its front, removed in 1826. But that isn't the case for Walmgate Bar, which is the only town gate in England which still has its barbican, built in the 14th century.
I agree with you. York has some of the best walls, and it is great fun walking around, and the views from the walls as well, the York Minster, the general historic buildings of York. And there's a fantastic trail. We'll give a plug to the Friends of York Walls, who have an audio trail, which is really detailed. So it's well worth doing if you get a chance to go to York, and we will be going to York for the podcast. A city we did visit on the podcast, and we loved the walls, as good as York, you might argue. I'm talking about Chester, of course.
I think indeed you could make that argument. More walls that constitute a major attraction for their city. The most complete remaining walls in Britain, they circle almost the entire medieval city for 2 miles. And do, I think, have a similar aesthetic feel to York's walls, probably dating from their renovation and repurposing into a kind of leisure attraction around the same time. But they do have very distinct histories because, unlike York's walls, Chester's were quite well preserved historically. Despite suffering some damage during the Civil War, their upkeep was funded, specifically by a local tax on linen, and they were turned into a public walkway and repurposed as leisure facility a fair amount earlier than York's. The walls continued to be maintained after this, which is some evidence of how popular they must have been, and they became a key part of the city's branding. Specific guides were produced to the walls really very early on. I think as well as comparing Chester with York, it's quite interesting to compare the different approaches taken to walls in Chester with the approach taken in another brandable historic town, Bath. In Chester, the walls were repaired, renewed to make them attractions in themselves, whereas in Bath, as we've discussed about other places, the walls were seen as an obstacle and almost completely demolished to make way for other urban attractions. They weren't seen as an attraction in themselves, nor was that seen as a possibility. But back to the Chester walls, they're unique not just for their completeness, but for their deep history. The original walls were Roman, and some Roman tower foundations have been found within the foundations of the walls. They were strengthened in Saxon times as protection against the Danes and because of Chester's importance as a Mercian city. And they later saw some military action during the Civil War when they were used for observation and gun placement, with Morgan's Mount on the walls being constructed specifically as part of the reinforcement works then. Personally, I love that the bridges and towers are this really great mix of styles and eras. Some have been rebuilt in the Georgian era, some are originally medieval. Highlights are the Northgate Bridge, which is right on the location of the Roman entrance to the city and was built in 1810 to replace the medieval Northgate Bridge. Phoenix Tower, which is linked to the apocryphal story of Charles I standing here watching his soldiers defeated at the nearby Battle of Roton Heath. The truth is probably that he stood in the cathedral's tower instead, but it's still a nice local legend. My favourite part of the walls, though, it's a very unusual bit. The walls are directly running alongside the racecourse. You can actually walk down straight from the top of the walls into the racecourse from an entrance on the road on top of the walls, or you can even just watch from the top of the walls for free. It's a great juxtaposition of heritage and modern leisure.
I think you're right. And at that point, the wall is really tall as well. And they are quite tall around Chester, actually, because Chester, it's built on high land. It's on a high level, so you get some quite big drops on the walls. And as you say, it's just great fun. I think I went for a morning jog along the walls. I mean, I'm not sure about the trip hazards of running along the walls, actually, but well, I'm still here.
I like as well the fact that, although I've said I like the fact that York seems to encircle the centre of the city, in Chester, it's almost the opposite. Some parts of the walls cut right through the main centre of the city. You can kind of walk on high over the shops and the pedestrians below.
I do wonder, though, it's really interesting, that contrast with Bath, and I wonder if it's because Bath became dominated by Regency arc, and maybe it was felt that the wall wouldn't have been consistent with that.
Possibly. I think it's more that Chester just had these well-maintained walls that they were perhaps a little bit easier to repurpose. I wonder if they hadn't been in such good condition, would that ever have crossed anyone's mind? It might just be a happy accident of history for Chester.
Yes. Yeah, that's right, because of the cost. So those are some of the most famous city walls. But another town that's got really excellent intact walls is Berwick upon Tweed.
Yes, somewhere a little bit different now. As far north as you can get in England, really. It's right on the Scottish border. Famously, the Berwick's football team actually plays in the Scottish League. Because of this location, Berwick as a town was always a little unique. It changed hands between Scotland and England many times throughout history. And historically, it was always named separately on both declarations of war and peace treaties. This led to the very famous absurdity of it still technically fighting the Crimean War with Russia until well into the 20th century due to its omission from the peace treaties. But the relevance to us now is that this meant Berwick had a genuine defensive need for big city walls quite a bit later than other cities. This due to threats from Scotland through Tudor times and right up to the Jacobite rebellions in the 18th century. Now, the walls we've looked at so far have been mostly, I think you'd say, medieval in their aesthetic, but Berwick's are a little bit different. Their current city walls were built comparatively later, under the Tudors mainly, from 1555 until 1558. There are some parts of the previous medieval wall built by Edward I remaining in the north of the town. The octagonal bell tower actually combines the two eras. It's mainly Elizabethan, but you can note it has a medieval base at the bottom. And the walls had their practical use as a defensive structure much longer than other city walls because of their location. So they even include artillery defences as part of their structure. This isn't to say that the walls never faced threats to their existence. I've managed to find a plea from a local vicar in 1905 at a local meeting to preserve at the very least the oldest parts of the walls, some of which had recently been pulled down. So clearly there was some kind of threat of development to them into the 20th century. But the vicar did get his wish, or at least most of it, because while the surviving walls aren't as complete as York's or Chester's, I think it's fair to say they're at least as key a feature of the town. Nicholas Pevsner called Berwick one of the most exciting towns in England precisely because it feels so enclosed by the walls. One specific unique feature I'll call out is its original bastions. The bastions are the parts of the walls which jut out in this kind of angular projection. They're particularly well preserved because they were actually constructed originally by an Italian engineer using a new construction technique from Italy. So really, they do show their relative youth of the walls very, very well.
I agree with Pevsner. It does enclose the town, and the town is quite small. And I think there's only 3 ways into the town, the enclosed part of the town, which is the road from the station, which comes through a small relatively small gateway, and the 2 bridges. Berwick's in this quite dramatic location naturally anyway, next to the Tweed and the North Sea, and it just adds to that drama. So I sort of follow what Pevsner's saying. Going to the other end of the country is Southampton.
Yes, we're going from the extreme north to the extreme south. I'll start with Pevsner again here. He said, in all of Britain there are few, if any, examples of medieval urban defences as impressive as those in Southampton, which is very high praise. The walls are less complete than the others we've seen, but Pevsner liked Southampton's town walls because they were more varied and, in his view, interesting in their mix of styles. To give a short history of the walls, the town of Southampton as we know it today took shape under the Normans. It contained a castle, the high street, and the current southwest area of the town. The defences surrounding all of this were originally simple banks of earth surrounded by ditches, with 2 gateways built in 1200, one of which Bargate still survives in a modified form today. But the first stone walls were built in the early 1200s on the southeast sides, with the circuit completed on the other sides by around 1290. The only gap that was left was on the south side, facing the sea. Clearly the thinking was, well, the sea will protect us from attack. But this thinking lasted until the 14th century, when there were brutal French raids on the town in 1338, leading to shoreline defences being built to complete the circuit. And these walls survive now. They're known as the arcades. And today, while most sections to the east and the south of the town have gone, quite a lot of the walls still remain. The north wall survives only in parts. In the 1930s, part of it next to the Bargate was demolished for a roundabout. And even as late as the 1960s, we were still knocking holes in the wall to build a ring road. The highlight of what you can see today, though, undoubtedly is Bargate. The surroundings, for some of the reasons we've mentioned, aren't particularly sympathetic with the recent demolitions and development that have gone there. But in its own right, it's probably the most detailed and ornate gatehouse in the country, and one of the oldest surviving, with the central archway surviving from the 12th century, though it's been, if you look at it, you can see it's been much built on since then. I suppose my view of Southampton's walls, they are fantastic. They perhaps fall a tad short of the others we've looked at aesthetically, because they don't surround the current core of the city in such a complete and delineated way. You don't feel like, as in York or Berwick, you're entering a new separate place when you pass through the gates or over the walls. But no doubt what we have is definitely worth going to see, particularly if you're in Southampton anyway.
Well, I think we need to do an episode on Southampton, because I do not know these walls at all.
Have you ever noticed the Bargate?
A few times, but I've just never had time. So, well, we need a YOG episode to Southampton, clearly.
We do. The Bargate is quite central. That's something you'll notice if you see it. That's a very notable feature of the town centre. Yeah,
another place we've got on our list, of course, is Exeter, which has city walls as well.
Absolutely, staying in the south. Nearly 3/4 of the total circuit of Exeter's walls survive, which is very impressive. They form a kind of rough rectangle of about 1.5 miles in length around the medieval area of the city. They rise to a highest point of about 2.5 metres, though you can't walk on them, unfortunately, like in York and Chester. The walls do still have a few turrets and bastions. The origins of these are unclear, but they may be Saxon or perhaps even Roman. Exeter's walls have a few other interesting points. Not least historically, they are Roman and stem in this respect from the original Roman military settlement that founded the city, so they really are kind of as old as the city itself. They have, as you'd expect, been substantially rebuilt since then by the Saxons, who reconstructed the walls as the city was made a fortified burh. And this need for defence in Exeter continued following the Norman conquest. It became a royal town and one of King John's residences for a short time, when, in the Middle Ages, 4 medieval gates were built on the site of the Roman gates, which were, and unfortunately these were demolished in the 18th century. As with many old medieval defences, the walls had a brief revival for military use during the Anarchy and the later Civil War, when the city was besieged twice. And the walls themselves were attacked by the Prayer Book rebels. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Prayer Book rebels, but they were a group kind of rebelling against objecting to the Reformation, specifically as instituted by Edward VI in 1549. They besieged Exeter and tried to undermine the walls before they were defeated by the Royal Army. But perhaps most importantly to Exeter's history, the city walls are probably the main reason why the city of Exeter has a cathedral. The bishop used to sit in nearby Crediton, but he moved his seat to Exeter because the walls offered greater protection. as well as the fact that Exeter was simply larger, but the walls were certainly a major deciding factor there. As I said, nearly 3/4 of the total circuit survives. It seems to be a bit of a mystery why so much still exists. There were damaged in the 18th and 19th centuries, including those gatehouses being torn down, and buildings were constructed right up against the walls, but it doesn't seem like anyone ever wanted or felt the need to demolish them completely. I found some evidence of some late antiquarian appreciation of the walls in detailed tales of local lectures on the history and newspaper articles. So maybe this antiquarian appreciation helped with their preservation somewhat. We just don't know, really. Looking at them today, although so much survives, it is probably fair to say the walls are a bit tucked away. You can visit Exeter and not even notice they're there unless you go looking for them or happen across the right areas. But if you do, I think you'll find them rewarding to visit.
It is interesting they've survived because Exeter's had a couple of quite dramatic waves of urban reconstruction. It had a lot of Georgian refurbishment, and then it had the post-war reconstruction because it was heavily bombed, and it's got some quite heavy-handed reconstruction, which is not to everyone's taste. So it is surprising that as much as 3/4 of the walls have survived. I can't remember seeing them when we went.
No. As I said, it's
back, but we didn't have a lot of time.
It's easy to miss them, I suppose. Also because people, if they go to Exeter and looking for architectural delights, they're probably going to look at the cathedral first. That's probably where you'll head first.
Well, look, we've talked about some of the best walls in the country. There, some of the most well preserved. I think it's worth touching on a few that are left with more fragments.
Yeah, I know you've been for a walk today, haven't you, Liam?
Yes, I did. In anticipation of this episode, I went for a lunchtime stroll, and it was very enjoyable until it started raining. I had a little stroll around the City of London, which has a wall, in bits of wall, not as well preserved as the places you've just spoken about. And it encloses the City of London, which is the oldest part of the city, and it was constructed originally by the Romans, 190 AD. And it's around 6 metres high in places. It's got some fairly impressive sections. You can see a decent section just north of the Tower of London. And if you walk around a trail, which is well signposted, takes you via a road called London Wall to the Barbican, aptly named, where there's further sections of wall. It's got a Roman base, but it was extended to become much taller and more substantial throughout the medieval period, and there were a number of gates built. Not much of that fortification left. Some interesting facts about this wall that I discovered on my walk today. So some well-preserved sections near the Barbican, which is, if you don't know it, a large brutalist post-war development, but one of the better ones, very impressive. But there's fragments of the wall around that development, and some of them have got some of the earliest large-scale uses of brick. The Great Fire of London in 1666, this wall, particularly on the northwest side of the city, actually stopped the fire. It demonstrated that brick stone construction can be a good way of preventing fires. But like we mentioned in Exeter and other cities, much of the wall was torn down and just forgotten. You know, as you said, in other places, no one really cared much for the walls. It was just obstructing traffic. And it wasn't until the large-scale bombing of areas like the Barbican in the Second World War that parts of the wall became uncovered, and it was in this period when there was more of a movement to preserve the walls. So some of those areas that we see now that actually came about as a result of clearances of buildings after the war. Like in many towns and cities, one of the major legacies of the walls is the street pattern that remains. Many famous streets, such as London Wall, Bishopsgate, Moorgate, Billingsgate, Cross Wall, are named clearly after this wall. Although there's not much of it to see today, there is an excellent walking trail, which I did, which has some good plaques, so it's worth doing. And one of the most enjoyable features of that walk is some of the varied architecture you see as you do the walk. And one of the most fun bits, although you can't walk on top of the wall itself, some of the high walks developed as part of the Barbican development give you some great bird's eye views of the sections of the walls that remain. Today, a new kind of defensive structure actually replicates the roots of the London walls, a modern ring of steel, as it's called. But instead of being a traditional wall, this is a modern defence for the city. and its institutions, composed of cameras, barriers, police sentry boxes and bollards. And they were created in 1993 to protect the city against IRA terrorism. And you can see those structures today. So it's a strange contrast that 2,000 years later, London has constructed a modern city defence.
It's fascinating what you said about the high walks and the Barbican area. I'd never realised from up there you could see the fragments of the walls. What's the best way to explore them, do you think? Are there good online guides? Is there an audio tour? Is it just walking around the general area using Google Maps?
Well, I found a trail by accident. So I knew there was a fragment near the Tower of London, just north of the Tower of London, where the sections of wall get hidden behind hotels. It's quite a bizarre juxtaposition. You've got these modern hotels with these nice courtyards where they've preserved the walls. But with each section of wall that's visible, there's some signage that's quite good descriptions. And then if you follow the line of the wall, you come across buildings where there's sections of the wall in the basement. So
does it feel like a continuous wall? Does it just feel like a stretch of fragments dotted about that you're trying to link together? Is there kind of a coherency to it, do you think?
No, you have to use your imagination.
Okay.
I think it's fair to say. If you're thinking about it, you do come across street with the names Oldgate, Bishopsgate, Moorgate. So you feel like you're following it round, and then you come across a fragment. So it can work, but yes, you need to use your imagination.
No,
but
fascinating.
I think a similar place in terms of the fragments, although there's definitely more of it, actually, thinking about it, where we visited recently, and that was Great Yarmouth.
Well, I'll tell you what, should we move on to kind of some of our other favourite places? We won't go to we won't go through these in so much detail because the podcast would last 2 hours. But there was, I think, about 5 more places which I think are worth picking out just very briefly. And let's start with Great Yarmouth because
one of my favourites, Great Yarmouth.
Absolutely, yeah. Like Berwick, actually. Great Yarmouth city walls were, although medieval originally, repurposed under Elizabeth I's reign when they were strengthened to defend against the threat of Spanish invasion. They are very unusual in that contemporary records of their construction survive. The British Library has detailed accounts of the local tax, murage, the French mur for wall, levied to build it from 1336 to 1345. Two of the unique features there are the toll house and the jail, one of the oldest jails and one of the oldest public buildings in the country. Another really good one, actually, and very, very different from the other ones we've looked at today, is Wareham. Wareham in Dorset, which might not be somewhere many people have visited. There isn't much to see in the way of, in fact, there's nothing to see in the way of masonry, because the walls, such as they are just grass-covered humps, really, grass banks encircling the town. But they are from a unique time period because they are the best preserved Saxon defences in England. It was very unusual for Saxons to construct masonry walls. They pretty much only dealt in banks of earth and ditches as urban defences. They were originally built for defence against Viking attack, and they're especially good to see because they really do, more than I think any other example you'll see, completely encircle the town. The entire central urban area of Wareham is within the walls. So yeah, fascinating to see if you can get down there.
Yeah, I'd recommend a trip to that part of the country if to listeners. Corfe Castle, Wareham, very pleasant.
Carlisle, definitely. We should talk about Carlisle.
Carlisle, very briefly. Good.
1.4 miles of it survives, so quite a lot. What I like is that lots of it, like the castle, is kind of built in a red stone, which gives the walls and all the defensive structures quite a unique look. And it does feel, I think, a bit more like a properly enclosed defensive city. And it's good that you can actually see inside certain sections of the wall, like the impressive castle and the citadel. The citadel is probably, apart from the castle, the most impressive set of buildings that are part of the walls. It's a set of buildings which includes 2 large towers which stand at the southern entrance to the city. And this was also built in Tudor times as a fortress for the city, really, because it was right on the frontier of fighting against Scotland. Unfortunately, the citadel was almost completely destroyed by the Scots in 1684, but it was later modified and some sections completely rebuilt in the 19th century. The walls had later uses. One, the west part still has a practical function as kind of a cliff edge against the river that goes through the city. But also, parts of the citadel were later converted into a court, and you can actually have tours around one of the towers to see some of the old courtrooms and cells. I think you have to arrange them in advance, but definitely worth doing if you want to see a proper old Victorian courtroom and cells. Another one to talk about is Colchester. Again, one we've visited before, so we'll just talk about it briefly. But these are important because they're the earliest city walls in Britain. Original Roman walls, built for defence after Boudicca sacked the town. The Balkan Gate is particularly important. It was built from 65 to 80 AD. It's the largest surviving Roman gateway in Britain. The only other Roman gate I'm aware of that survives in a recognisable form is the Newport Arch in Lincoln. So really very, very unique. And finally, very briefly, talk about Canterbury. Canterbury's good because it has lots of great visible medieval remains. 17 towers remain, plus a gate. It possibly loses some marks because one long stretch has a really horrible modern road that runs right alongside it, but still, hugely impressive amounts of it survives.
Now, I'm going to have to stop you because we have gone through lots of city walls there, and it has been absolutely fascinating. But we're going to have to draw this to a close because I know you could go on and on. I'd like to ask you, what are your favourite walls? Are you sticking with York?
Oh, my favourite walls. Chester is close, but I don't think there is an experience in the country like walking around the city walls of York, seeing the Minster, seeing the stations, seeing all of the great fantastic buildings and sites of York. Yep, I think that's number one for me.
So that's your favourite. What about best preserved?
Best preserved, possibly York again.
Probably
Chesters
York.
Are also Yorks or Chesters, I think I'd go for.
Which would you say? Which the largest?
I think it's York. I think I'm giving York as the answer to every question here.
York is winning. York is
2.75 miles long. I think that's the longest one we've seen. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's the longest.
Definitely the longest that still exists.
Yeah.
But I gather historically Norwich, but there's not much of it left.
No, there's a bit of it.
There's a bit, but again, it's next to a road. Big chunk next to a big horrible road. But
stop building roads. That's the answer.
Well, Colchester as well. There's a chunk next to the road, I think. Balkern Gate is right next to a road. Big, inner urban motorway. Which is the oldest looking wall?
Oldest looking? Depends on your perspective. I suppose you could say Wareham, because it looks so basic. But Colchesters are the oldest, and they do look very old, but they're not in their original state. So it's a very difficult question to answer. I suppose you'd have to say Colchester just because they are the original Roman walls.
Possibly a silly question. Do we know, what would we say, and this is a difficult question, which has been the saddest loss? I mean, which city had great walls that are no longer so great?
I think that's an easy one. I think you'd have to say Coventry. Coventry, it was described as the best defended city in England outside London. And although some tiny fragments survived, there was a real deliberateness to the destruction of the Coventry's walls. It was destroyed after the Civil War, deliberately, so earlier than many others, and it wasn't a piecemeal kind of, let's pilfer some of the stone for building something else. There was a real deliberate, conscious action to destroy them. And I suppose there's also kind of a local narrative to it, the fact that the medieval city of Coventry was destroyed by modern development and bombing during the Second World War. Also, the walls were destroyed earlier than that. I think if the two had been preserved, Coventry could have been the York of the Midlands or the Chester of the Midlands.
It has a wall of concrete around it now, sort of a big ring road. And another tough question, perhaps. Do we have a feeling on which walls have been the site of the most famous battle or the most effective in a battle?
That's tricky to say, I think, because we have such a different history from, say, to the continent in these things. I suppose you might say Lincoln from the Barons Wall, which we discussed in the Lincoln episode, the Battle of Lincoln. It's hard to say that any really stands out in that respect. There wasn't any, no city was a kind of great impregnable fortress like, say, the walls of Constantinople famously were. So, yeah, hard to say that one stands out, but maybe I'd go for Lincoln.
But I think what we've concluded from this episode is York has your favourite walls. I think I agree with you. Well, that was absolutely fascinating. And thank you to everyone who's been listening. Perhaps you've got some town walls that we haven't mentioned. Maybe your town has some fantastic walls. Maybe there's a story of walls that we've missed. Do get in touch with the show. And if you want to learn more about the places we've discussed, we've got We've done about 15 episodes on various towns, and we've got many more in the pipeline. Please visit our website, www.yeoldieguide.com, or you can contact us on Twitter at yeoldieguide. Otherwise, I think that's all from us on Walls.
That was an excellent episode. I really enjoyed that. And yeah, it's goodbye from me.
Fantastic research, Daniel. Thank you. See you in our next episode. Bye-bye.
Bye.